Stephen, thank you for joining us tonight. Tell me, how did you first get involved in, we're going to talk about music first. How did you get involved in music? When did your music life start?
Oh my goodness. I was very, very lucky because when I was at junior school, I was born and brought up in the East End of London, in East Ham, London Borough of Newham as it is now. And they were quite early adopters of the idea of having peripatetic music teaching in schools. And I was still at junior school when somebody came round and said, if you want to learn the violin, form a queue. Yes. And there was a very, very long queue for the violin. And there was another instrument called the cello, which had a very short queue for it. So I joined the short queue and was put on the cello. And I think it was part of my character then, because I didn't really get on very well with the first couple of teachers that I had. People would come round to the school and then a few of us would be taken out of class and we'd sort of spend half an hour tuning up the instrument, learning how to sit properly and then go away and so on. But eventually I got a couple of very, very good teachers, one after the other. And this kind of moved me through grade 8 and so on. And we had a very good youth orchestra. And really, I'm a hopeless pianist. I mean, I know how to play the piano, but I'm not a pianist at all. Probably if I was a better pianist, it would have been more tempting to actually go to music college, but I kind of had my heart set on doing medicine anyway, so I went and did that.
So were you set on doing medicine from a young age?
Yeah, for regular attendance at Sunday school, when I was about 8, I got given a little red line biography, it was called, of Alexander Fleming. And I thought that was much more interesting than anything else I'd ever read before. I was quite a voracious reader when I was very tiny. But that seemed a good thing to do because he not only was brought up, I think, on a croft and used to tickle trout for a laugh, but then became a famous bacteriologist. And I could pronounce the word bacteriologist by the age of 8 or 9. So I was thought that's what I want to do. And indeed, the idea of possibly doing pathology kept me going right until I discovered I was quite severely colourblind. And trying to do, when I was actually doing medicine and doing pathology, I couldn't tell the difference between different dyes under the microscope, So eosinophils.
That's how you found out you were colourblind?
Well, I was vaguely aware of it before that, but the fact that it might be a handicap in those days, I mean, you really had to know colours to be able to do anything under the microscope with stains, different red dyes and blue dyes and things that they use. I found great difficulty with that. And although my tutor at Cambridge told me that you could actually tell the difference between the different white blood cells under the microscope by looking at the texture and granularity and shape of them. But he couldn't answer the question when I said, so why do we bother to dye them then? Why do we bother to state
You could have become an electron microscopist.
Well, yes, probably more of an issue later on, but anyway, so general medicine seemed to be a thing until I actually got quite interested in psychiatry, so I did that. So and then I thought, then I thought psychiatry was a bit tedious, so I took off and did neurology for a bit, after which there's really an out for it, but epilepsy, because that's neuropsychiatry, isn't it?
Do you think that that neurologists and psychiatrists should train together?
Well, we would both be very different species if we did do. And it's very interesting how over the decades it seems to me we've diverged more and more and more. I mean, I've seen psychiatry become to me, almost not a medical specialty anymore. I know some psychiatrists would probably want to strangle me for saying that, but my last years as a consultant, I've been retired for 10 years now, so I'm probably way out of date, but it just struck me that we moved away from any idea where you might have a differential diagnosis and do some tests and work out what was, the problem was, and blah blah. And instead, it all became just to do with risk management. All that happens in British psychiatry is risk management, as far as I could see. That's the first thing you have to do. Make sure you're not going to get sued. That people are going to be safe. You have safeguarding things and so on. And one of the reasons I actually retired when I did was because they then decided to have a rule that we were getting too many inappropriate referrals from primary care. Mm-hmm. So, and incidentally, what I did was neuropsychiatry. I was employed to do epilepsy and neuropsychiatry, but nevertheless, was sucked into this thing where all referrals coming to me were first of all vetted by a committee which I wasn't on, which mainly consisted of social workers, as far as I could see, and managers. And then, I had a certain reputation in my field, but somebody from somewhere up country, a GP, wrote and asked me for a second opinion on a patient who had complex epilepsy. And the first thing I knew about it was when I was copied in to the letter that came back from the Committee on Public Safety, or whatever it was calling itself at that time, simply to the GP saying it was an inappropriate referral and you couldn't refer them to me. I had no say in the matter at all. So I just thought,
that's pretty shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, that was one of a number of reasons why I just thought I'd give it up, because I just lost the puff to try and fight against that sort of nonsense, really. So
what do you think about the trend for psychiatrists in working with intellectual disability not to treat the epilepsy, to see themselves, to refer all the problems with epilepsy to other specialists?
I don't think that is a trend, actually. I thought the opposite was starting to happen now, I think, due to, because I had kind of trained up a successor, and he's really doing extremely well. And,
yes.
And that's working out all right now. And I think, in fact, he's just got a tenure chair in the university, so in neuropsychiatry. And so epileptology becomes pretty big time in that. This is important because actually, when I found working with neurologists and trying to talk to them about the particular types of epilepsy and how that interacts in people with intellectual disability, and how the epilepsy interacts with the brain function and the particular types of interestingly unusual psychiatric conditions that can emerge in that, and how that has to be on the basis of understanding the genetics of some various things, everything from cerebral palsy through tuberous sclerosis or whatever, and have different ways of presenting different drugs. This is not in the normal skill set of neurologists to do it. Neither is working in the community teams that you need to do, which is even more important. My work for the last 20 years or so, 15 years probably of my career, was almost entirely community-based. I was doing home. I remember, I'd go and visit people at home because they were tetraplegic, and or they were so autistic that they couldn't travel, that sort of thing. And I was talking to a group of neurologists about it. I was giving a teaching session to some neurologists about it, that sort of work we did and this sort of stuff. And I said, and I mentioned this, that we did that, and they all looked very puzzled and said, "Oh, don't do domiciliaries. GP does that." And what do you do with people who are very, very ill and really, really need a specialist attention, but cannot make it to the hospital? Didn't do it. So it's because they don't go outside the hospital. They don't have the concept of being in the community. I spent the last 10 years of my working life driving around Cornwall, a place of outstanding natural beauty, and visiting nice people in their homes, which is very, very good.
Yes. Getting lots of nice cups of tea and biscuits.
There's that as well, and that's right. And of course, we pioneered some aspects of telemedicine as well. So I used to sometimes see people by video link when we could do that. It was slightly pushing uphill then because people didn't want to do it. Now it's all very trendy and everybody wants to do it, but we did get a grant and did do it for a while, so I didn't have to travel quite so far for some of it.
Yes. But you mentioned the involvement of psychiatrists in epilepsy, but this is not something that's throughout the whole of the country, because there are other areas where the opposite is happening. So it is a concern, I think.
And as to whether neurologists want to get involved in this, well, there are several generations of neurologists, aren't there? And I think the older generation that wouldn't know one end of a psychiatric thing from another, mainly dying out. And because neurology, when I first did it, was mainly a diagnostic specialty. So you'd go along with a complicated series of problems, and this very clever person would diagnose it by doing very clever tests, and then they'd say, "Congratulations, I've been very clever, and I've been able to diagnose you with Oblomov syndrome or something." And the patient was supposed to say, "Thank you very much, sir," and back out of the room bowing. And any treatment for that? I didn't know. I'll write to your GP and tell you to see a physiotherapist or something. And that was kind of what it was like. If we're going back 40 years or something. But it's been developed into a specialty where people can actually treat things. And they can get involved with patients and follow them up and make them better. And that is a bit, and epilepsy is a bit like that, because when I first started out in it, there were only about 3 drugs. I thought this is a good thing to specialize in. There's not many drugs to treat it. It's not that complicated. It's wonderfully complicated. And I was involved, I was involved in the early clinical trials of a whole new generation of anti-epileptic drugs that came along, and all the things that they then needed to do, and developing epilepsy surgery, which I was quite keen on. I did quite a lot of work on that when I was in Manchester, set up the epilepsy surgery program there, and so on. And that's all brilliant, And then I got interested in all sorts of other things. Well, what could we do as psychiatrists? There was a literature on psychological self-control of seizures. Well, we know that seizures are related to arousal. I mean, if you have epilepsy, your chances of having a seizure at any one time depend upon various, your brain state. Basically, if you become a bit under aroused, or EEG slows up a bit too much, whatever, then a seizure might break out. But learning to recognize these signs and control them actually is possible for some people, not for everyone, but for some. And so we did a bit of work on that and published a bit on it, and got a modest reputation. But it's very difficult because that is actually relatively simple to work on, but a bit time consuming, and you need to have people who know what they're doing about behavior therapy and so on, and psychotherapy, which is again outside the skill set of neurologists. And also, you can't get multi-million-pound grants for it, because it's not to do with whatever the MRC is currently deciding to push money into, or the Wellcome, or what used to be whichever thing from the European Union beginning with H. They used to do Horizon Helios or whatever. Millions and millions of euros and millions of pounds, but they will spend on anything that has high-tech gizmos in it, and preferably is to do with genetics. That seemed to be the thing. I remember having a conversation with somebody at the MRC about this, that we want to look at outcomes in childhood epilepsy, newly diagnosed, and so on. So, well, of course, you won't get any money at all unless you start doing genetic studies with it. Make sure you take blood from everybody and say you're going to look at their DNA, and then you might get the grant, sort of thing. And that was
and certainly farmers.
Research is not what people actually want to do necessarily. It's not what intelligent people and bright people necessarily want to do. Research has become something that a tick box exercise, and it's a bit sterile, or can be. I mean, you can of course get on and do research and so on, but you have to be very creative about it. If you want to do a creative research process, fits, doesn't it?
There seems to be another problem, and that is that the more money you get, the better, rather than the more efficient you are. So you have a dichotomy between the NHS always asking for efficiency, and research where the bigger the grant, the better, and it doesn't really matter whether it's efficiently spent. So that's a problem.
I think there is a big problem there, yeah. But I've been retired for 10 years, so I don't have to worry about that anymore.
So, but in your career, you managed to be an incredibly active physician, to be quite a trailblazer in a number of areas, and you also managed to keep up your music. So how did you do that?
Well, I could have kept it up better.
What was your secret?
But, and it lapsed for various periods of time and then came back, I suppose. Most of it helped. Being married to a professional cellist helped, I must say, because there was that culture at home that I could work with, and Sue might pass on the gigs to me sometimes as well. is a good thing to do. So yeah, that was true. And then you have to be careful, I suppose, to do a bit of bouncing around. When I moved to Cornwall, I used to do quite a bit of work with what was then called New Devon Opera. Unfortunately, like most opera companies, it's no longer has the money to afford a band. It doesn't really do much now. But at the time when it had a proper band, it was a decent, in fact, internationally recognised opera company with good international reviews. If I'd been asked to play, I was asked to play every year in the band for that for quite a long time, and it would involve sometimes evening performances way over in Devon. So I try and book annual leave, or at least a half day, to get to the concerts here in time for that sort of thing. So I used to have to do that. Could work around it a bit. And then going to, the American Epilepsy Society is always about this time of year, isn't it? Sort of in November, beginning.
Yes,
of November.
yes.
Which is also used to be the Big Messiah performance in Truro Cathedral, and I got rung up and asked to do that once, and I was going to be in America, and so I said I can't do it, but my wife will do it. She's actually a professional cellist. So I passed it on to her. Yeah, I never got it back.
Yes. Wonderful. So does she give you tips on your playing?
Well, she doesn't play now, and she sort of retired from that a couple of years ago. It's mainly related to if I happen to be practicing and she happens to hear me, she might suddenly burst into the room and tell me that I'm doing something wrong. She considers me unteachable.
Oh.
But I think it helps a lot. I've learned an awful lot from her.
Yes.
Really. Also, I'm playing her cello at the moment, so that's good.
So how did Brainland come about? How did you get involved, and who started the idea of it?
Well, it's Ken and Andy, two old friends from medical school, and Andy was at Cambridge with me as well before that. Ken is an artist as well, and Andy writes. Well, Ken and Andy are gag writers, sketch writers anyway, and Andy writes plays and stuff, I suppose. But Ken, so a friend of mine once asked me to do something about with a Georgian poet called Wilfred Gibson, and who I'd never heard of. He was a First World War poet, friend of Rupert Brooke, and is relatively less known than he ought to be now. And I thought this was very interesting, and I casually mentioned it. I was actually going out for a meal with Ken, who got incredibly excited about this Georgian poet he'd never heard of because he loves poetry, and immediately started devouring Wilfred Gibson's stuff and getting it all out of the library and reading it and so on. And we had this madcap idea to try and do some work together on it, and he did some animation and drawings, and I set a couple of Wilfred's poems to music, including one which we then got performed in Penzance with a choir and two soloists and a full orchestra and everything, which I quite enjoyed doing. And then as soon as that was finished, I thought, right, I can get back to writing the book or whatever it was I was about to be doing before. And Ken said, so do you want to write an opera then? This idea. Yes. And he'd been doing some project with the I think with Queen Square, the National Hospital for Neurology, of an artistic nature about the history of psychosurgery and stuff like that. And he and Andy had the idea of producing a triptych opera, three stories, three operas, 3 one-act operas. And we had a discussion about it, and it seemed reasonable to, instead of doing that, to have one of these as an overarching narrative. So the whole opera actually is set in 1957 in a US Air Force base where people are waiting to take off to go and do some experiments in Oslo with their new piece of equipment, and they're held up by the fog. And so Gray Walter, who's the scientist in charge of the group, regales them with stories of what's happened in the development of how brainwaves came to be discovered by by Berger in 1924, and Monitz invented leucotomy in 1930s or something. Walter Freeman invented the lobotomy of the ice pick, and so on. In the 1940s, and then how the CIA got interested in mind control techniques, was actually paying for them to go and try out their new equipment on some people and do some experiments in Oslo. And why Oslo? Because Norwegian patients don't sue you. There's a little song about that at the end. And that meant we could move it around a lot. So we've got a couple of scenes in Jena, where in Thuringen, or Thuringia, or however you pronounce it, where Berger is discovering the EEG, but later on getting very depressed about it. A couple of scenes in the Mayo Clinic and in North America, where Freeman's doing the ice pick leucotomy and so on, and a couple of scenes in Lisbon where Monitz is working on leucotomy in Lisbon. And these required all different musical styles for each one. So we've got the group hanging about in the airport here, the Bristol group, and their work tends to be a bit more frivolous, I think, a bit more light-hearted. You know, it's got a serious undertone, but they've got more jokes than the rest. They don't like musical comedy. And then, you know, the Monitz sequences in Lisbon are rather Portuguese, and they're what I might call pseudo-fado as the style, because I did write something I thought sounded a bit like fado. I played it to a friend who lived in Portugal, and she said that sounds a bit like fado. So I rewrote it, but just anyway. But it sounds a bit, I don't know, Southern European, like that. I thought that Freeman, who developed the ice pick leucotomy, I got the impression from the libretto was absolutely crazy. I mean, and a bit of a psychopath. So his music is quite crazy and mostly doesn't have a key signature most of the time. And it's a bit frenetic and so on. And Berger's stuff, well, I use a Thuringen folk song, or one that was written in probably in 1820, but became regarded as a Thuringen folk song, which was also used by Brahms in the Academic Festival Overture, and that's kind of his Berger's tune as well as what that's about. And so each character, therefore, can have a leitmotif. You know, a few notes that you should recognise the character from. Freeman has one. Grey-Walter has one. Harry Crowe, who's a Scot, part of the Bristol group, and his neurosurgeon friend Dougie Phillips come on together. And so I had a sort of Scottish sounding thing for them to come into. And in the script, it says that Dougie Phillips has a public school accent, an English public school boy. And I made a little reference to the Eton Boating song in something he was singing, thinking that would be a laugh. Then I looked up Dougie Phillips and discovered he was actually a New Zealander.
Oh.
So if anyone ever performs this, I was going to suggest, you know, I give a prize to someone who can spot where in the score I have hidden the New Zealand national anthem.
That is very clever.
It is there somewhere.
They get a free ticket for another performance.
Yes.
Now, all of these, I think that people doing medicine like me often think that you can spot the various specialties by the second year of medicine. You can tell the psychiatrist from the surgeons. Clearly, in this opera, the psychiatrists and the neurologists and the pathologists, they're all quite a mixture. I mean, the personality differences are massive, and although I don't think this was an original intention, you've actually covered all sorts of personality types.
Oh,
do you find that they each have some redeeming factors? I mean, Freeman is not necessarily very appealing, but in what way is he, if any, what are his redeeming features?
Well, he really thought he was doing good. But he had this messiah complex. So I'm not very sympathetic to the Freeman person. I didn't really take to him out of it. And I think,
who do you like the most? Who do you resonate the most with of the characters?
Well, there's the earnest Harry Crow trying to get things right and find out how it's all about. Grey Walter had a bit of a messiah complex as well, but it was slightly more relatable too. Berger, we can't help but relate a bit to Berger, especially the younger Berger, who's slightly obsessional, not fairly modest and self-effacing, and has this nice wife and children that he likes to go for a walk in the park with and so on. And in the end, torn by, conflicted about what he's being asked to do and what he's being forced to do, which drives him to suicide. So maybe Berger up to a point. But I know in real life, Berger was probably more of a Nazi than is made out in the opera. I get that impression. Although, again, it's difficult to say whether he was just probably being dragged into that, as many people were. So I don't know. Monitz, also, a lot of these people had a bit of a messiah complex, I suppose, but Monitz really tried very hard to do the right thing. So maybe I quite like Monitz in a way, although he's quite self-aggrandizing and so on. But I think they all thought they were doing good. That's the thing. Thought they were great.
Yes.
Apart from Berger, who was shocked at the end to find that people liked him. He opens the copy of Brain, the journal, and sees that his work's been validated by E.D. Adrian in Cambridge, and is so delighted by that and gets all excited. So, but really, everybody else thought they were the tops before that. So they're all a bunch of bigheads, really, apart from him.
So psychosurgery has obviously been slated, and most it's often represented as having no value at all. What do you think in 50 years' time people will look back on that we're doing now and think this is absolutely shocking? How could they have done X or Y?
Good heavens, I have no idea. Well, we used to give people drugs. You have to think what you do is you give people drugs, and that's going to make them better somehow. And these drugs damage their liver and give them skin problems and all this. Whereas now we know perfectly well that you give them EEG biofeedback and teach them how to control their own seizures or whatever. Yeah, I think probably they'll be looking back on the drug, but this is the best we have now. What we're doing is our best. And
absolutely,
and we all think we're doing it for the right reasons and so on.
So one of the things that that as a neurologist has been fascinating to work with you who have such a different perspective on the world. It's wonderful. But tell me about object relations theory, because apparently this concept comes into the opera. I must admit, I didn't spot it myself, but tell us about that.
And I didn't say earlier on, of course, after Ken and Andy had decided that we were writing this opera, that it was thought we actually needed to bring a poet on board who could actually write proper songs and things. Because I was a friend of yours and knew you and discovered that you were a poet, then you came involved in it, and you've contributed greatly to the project as well. And then in course of conversation, I have mentioned that, well, of course, there's object relations theory, isn't it? There's a bit of the plot and so on. And that's something that Ken and I possibly are familiar with. Andy is a GP, probably not, definitely not if you're a neurologist, I would have thought. Object relations theory is a psychoanalytic concept, and psychiatrists of my generation will certainly have been familiar with the expression, if they struggled a bit with the exact meaning of it. But it originally was developed by Melanie Klein in the 1930s, I think, to look at psychological development in infants, and how the first relationship you have is with your mother's breast, and that sometimes that breast is nurturing and gives you succor, and sometimes it's withdrawn from you. And she postulated the infant has actually two internalized objects that they relate to, a good breast and a bad breast at that point. But later on, these objects become replaced by internalized versions of your loved ones and parents and so on. And this bit then gets into more broadly into psychological and psychoanalytic theory as well. You know, we all have an internal monologue or dialogue going on most of the time, don't we? And but who are you actually talking to? It's an internalized object. It's a representation of, it's influenced by, you know, your mother, father, lover, or whoever it is, you know, and how you relate to your internal objects is something that psychoanalysts got quite excited about at the time. It kind of drifted into mainstream psychology a bit as well, but then gets a bit diffused around the edges. Now, the opera was interesting to me. I couldn't help noticing quite early on that we have the muse, and the muse character. If you look at Berger's muse, in Act 1 is a good muse, and Act 2 is a bad muse. The good and the bad breast, a good and a bad. These are two bad objects. I mean, it wasn't really a young woman who came and dragged Berger away from his walk in the park and made him go to the lab and discover the alpha rhythm. There wasn't really a young woman who, dressed in a Nazi uniform, drags him off to make him sign all these documents and so on. This was an internal thing going on in his head. That internal thing was an internal object. Anyway, that's an object, internal object, that's object relations theory. And this is actually a theme throughout the opera. The narrator of the opera is a fictitious character who's a character in a novel by Grey Walter. But, you know, Grey Walter really did write the novel, and so she's a character in that, but she's an internal object of Grey Walter, really. And then, and of course, Freeman has his muse, he's a corpse. A talking corpse. It comes up, but that's kind of, that didn't really happen. But you know, even in that, we know it's something's going on in his mind. This is his monologue, his dialogue, whatever. That's an internal object. And then there's more, because the topsy, of course, the toposcope, the EEG toposcope, and the giveaway line is, I mean, she is treated like a character. There's a character in it, other piece of equipment. But then there's that little throwaway line at the very, very end of the opera when the narrator says that eventually Grey Walter abandoned Topsy in favor of a younger, more nubile piece of equipment, or worse to that effect. And that's, you know, that's pretty crucial, isn't it? That's also an internal object.